actions from now until 2050 determine whether we will limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. While both scenarios have severe environmental consequences, limiting warming lowers risks of biodiversity loss, sea level rise, reaching climate tipping points, and various other environmental, points of at risk. So as the textile industry accounts for an estimated 8 to 10% of global carbon emissions, it's clear that we must make immediate changes to reduce the carbon intensity of our industry. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. So Jacek, if you can please start the recording for today. So we will be recording the webinar and it will be available to participants after the webinar. Please ensure you're muted. I've been muting people as they've been coming in, so if you're surprised that you're on mute, sorry to me. But we'd like this to be an interactive presentation. So, if you have questions as they come up during the webinar, just please raise your hand or pop the questions in the chat and we'll get to those. Otherwise, your question might be answered today through the webinar, so you can hold on to those to the question and answer period. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. So firstly, Emily Reza is Program Manager for the Net Zero Challenge at Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC. She is responsible for engaging, recruiting, and working with companies and organizations interested in committing to net zero emissions by 2050, as well as overseeing the guidance and technical support that informs ECCC advice on creating credible net zero plans. Emily has 18 years of federal government experience, including program and project management and policy research and analysis. Next, Raphael Beauchamp is the Director of Regional Pathways at the Transition Accelerator, a pan-Canadian organization working to put Canada on a path to a competitive economy in a world driving to reduce emissions to carbon neutrality. He brings extensive experience in developing complex public policies and mobilizing stakeholders towards strategic solutions. With nearly a decade of experience in federal politics, he served as Senior Advisor to Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, as well as to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. In these roles, he played a leading role in designing and advancing government priorities on energy efficiency, critical minerals, innovation, international trade, and Canada-US relations. Raphael also worked as Director of Public Affairs for the Quebec Business Council on Environmental Technologies, where he coordinated the priorities of over 200 member companies from a myriad of sectors and translated them into effective public policies. Raphael holds a BA from McGill University and a certificate in Sustainable Business Strategy from Harvard Business School. And last but not least, Sneha Soni is founder and CEO of GreenNudge. With over 12 years of experience in data and analytics, she's developed business strategies across energy, fintech, life sciences, and media tech. Motivated by a deep commitment to advancing climate solutions, Sneha founded GreenNudge to help SMEs lead in sustainability. Their mission is to simplify decarbonization and empower businesses to turn circular practices into a lasting competitive edge. I'm so sorry I forgot to advance my slides, so I'm already failing on my job here. But anyways, they're on the screen, spotlighted for you there. So I'll first hand it over to Emily and Raphael to discuss the Net Zero Challenge and the Transition Accelerator before we move on to Sneha's Net Zero case study. And then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So I'll hand it over to Emily now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks for inviting me. Really excited to have this webinar. And thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time out of your very busy days to attend today. So I'm going to get started with a little bit of context and information about the Government of Canada's Net Zero Challenge program. Very excited to be here with CTIA. We do have a bit of a precedent working with the Canadian Textile Industry Association for a couple of years now. Some of you with long memories may recall that we presented the program to you, I think, in June of 2023. And a number of CTI members joined the Net Zero Challenge program in May of 2023 and some since then as well. So very excited to return to you. So I'll be talking a little bit about the program for those that aren't familiar with it, about the business value of setting emissions reductions targets, about the program benefits, the program requirements, and then I will be able to share some of the data that we've received through CTIA member reporting already. And then I will turn it over to Raphael Beauchamp to get a little bit further into more technical details around mitigation strategies available to the textile manufacturing industry in Canada. So hope to do that in about 10 minutes. So Lauren, if we can skip to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So what is the Net Zero Challenge program? For those of you that don't know, it is run by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it is essentially a voluntary program. So we're talking about what are the emissions reductions initiatives in the world. You may be very familiar with Science-Based Targets Initiative or other international initiatives, but in Canada, we're very lucky to have our own national program for emissions reductions. And what we're trying to do through this voluntary program is encourage businesses in Canada to develop credible and effective plans to transition all of their Canadian facilities and operations to net zero emissions by 2050. And so we end up working with businesses from across the country in all sectors. Next slide, please, Lauren. Thank you. So we often get asked, what is the business value of reducing emissions? And this, some of you may find this very redundant. It may be very familiar to you. Others of you, perhaps this will be helpful. But I think it's safe to say there's more and more research and analysis that's been done showing that there really are some positive value adds to reducing emissions right now. It's definitely become a real factor in competitiveness globally, which perhaps you're very familiar with. And we can look to the EU and its recent regulations to point to that fact. Definitely, we have seen amongst our participants, one of the main reasons for joining the program is shareholder pressure or shareholder interest in seeing their companies reduce emissions. We know that it can increase confidence for sure in investors. We also know that consumers are demanding new products. We definitely can also point to the research to find evidence that it's helpful in employee recruitment and retention. Lots of employees are looking for jobs in companies with sustainability commitments. We can see evidence where sometimes through improved energy efficiency means companies can actually reduce business costs. We know that it can increase climate resiliency against climate risk. So there's multiple different reasons, and there's a bunch of them presented on the slide there. And I'll move on to the next slide, please, Lauren. Okay, so let's talk about the Net Zero Challenge program specifically. So what are the program benefits? What can we provide you, frankly, as a federal program? So I did mention the fact that we're very proud to have a national Made in Canada program that's really been adapted for the Canadian context, first and foremost. But second, and really importantly, our job is to provide you with credible advice on how to make a transition plan. What should you have in your transition plan? How do you reduce your emissions? And so we have a freely available technical guide on our website. And beyond that, we have been listening to industry and working really closely with other partners to understand what are the other technical resources that could be very helpful to industry. And that is one of the main reasons why Raphael and I today are both presenting to you, because we have agreed on a partnership with the Transition Accelerator to provide specific technical guidance industry by industry. And he'll be talking more about the textile manufacturing net zero emissions primer, which should help you make your plan to reduce emissions. So the second point there is really about that credible guidance that is provided by the program to its participants. Thirdly is public recognition from the federal government. So we do profile our participants on our website, and we work really hard with our ECCC communications team to make sure that companies are profiled on our social media platforms in terms of their commitments and their achievements, and also at events where possible. We have a community of practice, so we have a monthly bulletin for participants. We host webinars and roundtables as much as possible, and you have access to our team. And so we're really trying to build that momentum and excuse me, make a space for participants to kind of learn from each other, and this is a perfect example of that. If you join the Net Zero Challenge program, there is no cost. And we have worked very hard also to make very simple reporting and align reporting requirements from our program with your perhaps your ESG sustainability reports or other initiatives that you're engaged in. And lastly, I'll just note that the joining or participating in the Net Zero Challenge program is incented in federal contracts. Right now, it's incented in large contracts over 25 million. But in the greening government strategy, the government will be seeking to incent that in lower dollar value contracts as well. So that's a good overview of program benefits for now. And Lauren, if we can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Okay. So what are the key elements of a net zero plan, or sometimes you might hear referred to as a transition plan, a climate transition plan? So what are we really talking about? There's really, I would argue, 5 main elements of a credible plan. So I'm going to talk about them here. So the first one is that commitment to reducing emissions, commitment to planning to reduce your emissions over time to net zero by 2050 in hopes that we can meet our Paris commitments and limit warming, as Lauren said, to between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So you're committing to transition planning for the next couple of years to reduce emissions by 2050 to net zero. And then your next step, one of the most important steps, is to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. So you need to develop a base year greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And that is it can be a bit complicated. It can be a bit daunting. There are international greenhouse gas accounting practices to follow. Our program is generally based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Happy to talk more about that perhaps offline, but that's one of the key elements of a plan. And next, you need to identify your mitigation strategies, which is probably a fair amount of what Raphael is going to address with you today. What are those mitigation strategies that you can implement and employ to reduce your emissions? And once you've looked at those, what kind of targets can you set? What is the first interim target, for example, that you can set to reduce your emissions by, say, 2030 or 2035? And then a second interim target and a net zero target. And then how have you incorporated all of this into your corporate governance, which is really important. This is about the accountability for your commitments and tracking your progress over time. And the last box there, just noting that offset credits, where they're very hard to abate emissions, may be needed at net zero, and sometimes they're needed even on the path to net zero where technology might not be available yet, for example. Next slide, please, Lauren. Great. So where are we at in terms of Net Zero Challenge participants? We have 281 companies. We're very proud of our participants. We've got some huge names that have joined the program. You'll be familiar with Microsoft Canada, L'Oreal Canada, Shell Canada, GM Canada, 6 airports. We have CN Rail, 3M. We've got lots of really big, well-known companies, and very proud to have 14 CTIA members as well. They're listed there on the slide, and some of you hopefully are in the audience today. So congratulations on your hard work. And maybe just of note, we do have a lot of small and medium enterprises that have joined the program, 206 of the 281. And I forgot right to text. I'm sorry, Emmanuel. Apologies, sincere apologies. Small and medium enterprises have really taken up the challenge, I would say. We've definitely seen that, and all of our CTI members generally are Canadian-based SMEs. Next slide, please, Lauren. Okay, so what have we seen so far from the CTIA participants? So 11 are reporting so far, and we have 11 that have completed their preliminary questionnaire, which is the first step in the program, and that means that they've made that commitment to make a plan to net zero emissions by 2050, and they've created a base year greenhouse gas emissions inventory. 2 companies have also submitted their comprehensive questionnaires, which means that they're in a place where they can identify their mitigation strategies, and they've set their first interim targets. So 10 companies have committed to net zero by 2050 and 1 to net zero by 2040 for scope 1 and 2. And just to note here that Davy Textile Solutions and Calco Group have both achieved bronze participation tier and have completed their comprehensive questionnaires. Next slide, please, Lauren. Perfect. So I wanted to give you a bit of insight into what we've seen so far in terms of the data that Canadian Textile Industry Association members are reporting to us. So in the first table there, you'll see that Calco Group and Davie Textile have both, as I mentioned, made a first interim target. So for Calco Group, 19% reduction of scope 1 and 2 by 2030. And for Davie Textile Solutions, 30% of scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2032. And these are in tons of carbon dioxide equivalency. And there's some mitigation strategies there noted on the right-hand side of the table. I'm not going to go through them because they're going to be actually presented more in depth in later part of our webinar today. So if you look at the second table in the slide, the other companies there, you can see the amount of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that have been reported, and you'll see a lot of variation. And a lot of the variation is probably due to size of business, size of operation, also type of thermal manufacturing process is my guess. And then sometimes it can depend on the province you're in and the access to the electricity grid that you have. And 3 of the member companies have also chosen to voluntarily report on scope 3. So they've measured scope 3 emissions in some of the categories listed there. So, use of sold products, purchased goods and services, employee commuting, business travel, etc. And that is the end of my part of the presentation. So perhaps, Raphael, I will turn it over to you to provide some more in-depth about our partnership.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That's very helpful. And just before I get too deep into the partnership, I just wanted to provide kind of an overview of who we are at Transition Accelerator and essentially what we do. And so as you see on the screen, Transition Accelerator is a not-for-profit, a pan-Canadian not-for-profit that really focuses on building Canada's economy in a world that is decarbonizing towards carbon neutrality. And so we really try to identify the nexus between emissions reductions and economic competitiveness, what lies in between for Canada across different sectors. And so our work is really partnering with specific industries in building decarbonization plans in different consortia, and then leading towards implementation of solutions and viable pathways for decarbonizations. You can move on to the next slide, Lauren. And our work at Transition Accelerator kind of focuses on various disciplines, but I think the first 2 that you see on the screen, electricity and future economy, are closely related to your sector. We've got a pretty strong team that is working on Canada's future electric grid and the growth that is required on that front, and especially the end uses and what needs to happen on the industry side to be able to capitalize on the opportunity that we have in Canada for low carbon electricity. And as well, future economy is defining essentially the pathways that enable industries, whether it's high emitting industries such as steel, cement, or others, or even subsectors of the economy, as we're working on with ECCC, to thrive and to gain market access in a world that is moving towards net zero. So those are kind of the 2 main elements that obviously tie into the textile industry, but we're working across the board to make sure that we look at various sectors in the economy to move forward. You can move on to the next one, Lauren. So more specifically about our partnership with ECCC, and the reason why I'm here today is ECCC has had a lot of success in attracting members and attracting companies to the Net Zero Challenge over the years. And that has led to a really big momentum in essentially companies building their own plans, setting interim targets, and moving towards decarbonization. And our work at ECCC in conjunction with ECCC is going to be bringing that program to its next stage. When we are chatting with stakeholders, I think one of the things that we hear is that the program is fantastic in enabling the planning and some of the resources to be available, but companies are in need for more resources to understand how to do a proper net zero plan, but also what available technologies or mitigation strategies are available to them. So we are developing with ECCC what we call decarbonization primers, and so those primers will aim to provide kind of high level yet intelligible and easy to access information for companies that are looking to plan their journey towards net zero. They'll cover kind of the foundational elements that we've talked about already, and that may be familiar to most on the call. but also our analysis in terms of where the sector is, what are the key sources of emissions that are in the sector, and when we look at the technologies available, which ones are the most viable ones to be able to be implemented towards 2050, with the ultimate objective that those companies take the primer and then are then empowered to be able to bring it down to their company level and understand exactly where their emissions stand and how to move forward from that perspective. You can move on to the next one, Lauren. So right now, where we are in the textiles industry is obviously we will be moving forward with a primer, and that goes without saying. But we've conducted essentially a preliminary analysis of some of the players in Canada and essentially where the emissions lie. And there's 4 kind of key insights I wanted to bring to everybody's attention that we are seeing from the sector. Obviously, I think many companies in Canada are using natural gas for one part or another of their process. And that contributes obviously a pretty significant part to their scope 1s. For companies that are using natural gas, usually that is the main source of emission that comes in when we're talking about natural gas being the main contributor. And so the key pathway for technologies that we are looking at is which ones are viable to transition from natural gas to, as an endpoint, electricity in due course. And obviously, the second point that you see on the bottom left, which is that companies across Canada are engaged in various different processes. Not one company is alike from another. And so our work is really trying to figure out and survey the Canadian market to see where the technologies would need to be located. And especially for companies that are looking to make their plans towards decarbonization, looking at where your different capital and equipment is located is going to be a critical part, because we're going to cover on the primer the main elements, but bringing it down to your level and being able to assess based on your technologies is going to be critical. The role of a clean electricity grid, that goes without saying for a number of companies that are in Quebec in the textiles industry, but also some in BC and other places where the electricity grid is already clean. And for the most part. So those companies have very low scope 2s, as we saw in the slide from Emily. And so much of the work will be on trying to reduce that scope 1 that is remaining for those firms. But for companies that may be located in Ontario or in other provinces where the grid is a bit more emitting, reducing the grid emission from a utility and from a provincial government perspective needs to be part as well of companies as they look to reduce their scope 2 emissions. And then finally, the importance of the supply chain strategy. I think folks on the call are well aware of trying to take a look beyond the facility and into circular economy practices to avoid landfilling. And then on the upstream, working with suppliers either to, on the freight side, look for electric alternatives, or also on textiles or products that are coming in, looking for recycled or low carbon content as a feedstock. You can move on to the next one, Lauren. And so where we are seeing things happening, this is a kind of a summary of where we are. And the primer, as I mentioned, will kind of hope to identify the main sources of emissions for the sector in Canada, but more importantly as well, the core actions that we are kind of seeing as being important for companies to consider as they're making their plans towards net zero. Thermal processes, of course, for companies that are involved in either steam or some form of thermal process and are using natural gas is going to be the core component to really focus on between now and 2050 in terms of how to electrify that process. Obviously, technologies that are in the market right now usually have a price premium compared to natural gas technologies. And so finding the right balance and ensuring that there's that you integrate the capital acquisition of electric equipment into the life cycle component of your existing natural gas equipment is that core strategy that we advise across the board, regardless of industry. The life cycle renewal of equipment is really that key juncture where companies can make the decision and plan their capital acquisition at that stage. Electricity use, of course, for companies that may not be on the thermal manufacturing side or that may have more a machine-heavy process. Some of them are in grids where the electricity is already clean, and so there's a lot done that is already done there. However, using energy efficiency measures, ensuring there's an optimization of process can lead not only to emissions reduction, but also to cost reductions from a business perspective, as the return on investments for often energy efficiency or improvements on the process side are very short. We range from 3 to 5 years, I think, from some of what the literature has to say on it. Transport and logistics, as I mentioned, fleets, so whether they're directly owned or whether they are part of a supplier is another element that's broader than the scope one, but that can be addressed with working with suppliers directly. And then obviously, as I mentioned, materials and waste, whether it's diverting or developing initiatives to avoid landfilling, or upstream, if you are taking in fibers from suppliers, working to ensure that those suppliers are using whether rPET or another form of recycled content. And so those are kind of the main actions and emission sources that we are observing. Definitely, I think as we are moving forward, we're curious to see, from a company perspective and from the sector's perspective, where you are seeing the biggest challenge from decarbonization, those sources. And I think the other thing I wanted to put in the window before I move over to Sneha is, I think as you see on the bottom right, these decarbonization practices don't exist in a vacuum. And so we are fully aware that companies, especially in the textiles industry, have other considerations that are both economical, that are both related to the tariffs that are ongoing with the United States, to global upheavals on the economic and trade blocks. So those recommendations that we are putting in the window into that primer for companies to ponder need to be considered, obviously, in the broader context of which ones make economic sense. And so the key recommendation that we are making above and beyond everything is for folks to really plan ahead and ensure that as you manage your capital flow over the next 25 years, that you manage it in a way that obviously enables you to maintain competitiveness, but also in due course, decarbonize your operations and gain in that way, not only operational efficiency, but also potential market access in different areas. And so I'll hop onto the last slide, Lauren. And that's just to provide a quick bit of information. Obviously, as I mentioned, definitely interested in this webinar is a great opportunity for us to do that, but definitely interested in hearing your perspectives on the ground in terms of how your plans are going and how you're feeling about the transitions to electric alternatives. We will be working on our side with ECCC over the coming months to be able to put that primer together, ensure that we've got real world experience that we can put into the primer. So if you are interested in participating and sharing some of your insights, we are more than open to having a conversation and ensuring that the primer reflects obviously the realities on the ground and we can be helpful in that way. So that's it. I'll move over to you, Sneha.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Thanks, Lauren and Jacek, for having this platform for us to discuss this important topic. And thanks, Emily and Rafael, to set a foundation of what we're gonna talk through the case study now. And before I jump into that, I basically want to give a bit of a background on what GreenNudge does. So when we founded GreenNudge, we saw some examples of companies who had the intention, but it did not meet the action, which we call the so-called intention adoption gap. And we started digging into why that is. And the primary reason is limited resources. And as you saw, like SMEs have 206 SMEs have committed to the Canada Net Zero Challenge. So the intention is right there. We wanted to make sure that those were matched with the resources required, and we all are working towards that, right? So GreenNudge has worked with several CTIA members and have walked the path of how do we do this in a way that is not just about sustainability, but also delivering on operationals and supply chain efficiency. Because if you see those reduction in your monthly bills, that will immediately reduce your emissions, and that actually makes a strong business case right there. Our platform aims to simplify and accelerate the net zero journey by aligning that action with the financial decision making. You'll see on the right, the screenshot's a bit fuzzy, I apologize, but on the left, you will be able to actually map your company, the way it exists, the number of facilities you have, what are the contributing sources of emission from the energy, waste, and water. And then on the right, you'll be able to marry that with your emission profile and the scenario planning. We'll dig into more details on what this actually means when we look at the case study. But the one thing that I do want to note here is the business case is really strong for both the cases, both the cases that we have seen with the CTIA members, and we want to make sure that it doesn't feel like a financial burden, but a financial opportunity especially for SMEs who have limited resources. Lauren can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the two things that we have seen that makes this journey really tough is one, obviously, that we have covered that you have probably one person or not even one person on your team who will be dedicated to this work. On top of that, there are several different questions that come up, which is some of them on the screen. I'm just going to read those out. How much investments can we really make? Right? What options can have the biggest impact? What is a realistic target? Who are the right people to partner with? And these tough questions, especially in a global supply chain, become quite overwhelming and can lead to inaction. The other important thing in a global supply chain that is an opportunity instead of a burden is that when one company or a company in part of the supply chain decarbonizes, all the downstream partners can see a massive impact because their scope 3 gets reduced as well. So all of this poses, opportunity for any company to think about this work. Lauren, we can go to the next slide now. Right. So with all those questions on top of your mind, with limited resources, what helps is going back to the first principle, which I think we have covered through this conversation. Is like, how do we bring operational and supply chain efficiency? Because that is the most financially viable climate strategy. Also, as you can see on the right in the screen, has been a significant drop in implementing energy efficiency upgrades in the recent years. The payback period has dropped, and it has become even more attractive to think of these solutions. So much so that you can future-proof your business model and enable the entire supply chain by making changes in your own operations. Next slide. All right, so let's jump in the case study, and we'll break it down so that you see why this was like the first part of the case study is going to look at what data exists right now. So we look at the baseline year, and then we see what is the trajectory of our consumption and emissions at the same time. And then the second part of the case study, which will go after this, is going to talk about how do we plan scenarios around the data that we have seen in the first part. So let's look at an example. So the facility in Alberta that consisted of the production floor, the office space, as well as warehouse space. And when we looked at the energy consumption, we saw that there was 64% of thermal consumption, so natural gas pretty much, and 36% electrical consumption. Alberta's grid is carbon intense, so and the electricity is like 4.5 times higher. So electrifying everything at this stage was not a solution. So we had to get creative in figuring out what would be the right strategy at this stage. What are the low-hanging fruits? What are the long-term plans that we want to evaluate to make sure the spend meets the financial benefit, right? For anyone to take, for anyone to think about this. So then we started looking at the spend. So how much we're spending for each, in for each of those buckets, and that gave us a good idea of how much dollars per ton of CO2 we are spending. So if the average is, as example, $250 per ton, then any carbon reduction measure that delivers savings that are lower than that would make a good, strong business case. And so to actually be able to take this forward, we had to collaborate with different vendors. Uh, Collaborating with vendors has two advantages. One, they will tell you what government grants are currently existing for those mitigation strategies. And second, they can actually give you a good estimate of how much savings you'll have and how much emission reduction you can achieve. We did evaluate 3 vendors because we wanted to get a good idea of what really is possible. And then once we have all that information pulled in, we wanted to feed that in the second phase, which is the scenario planning phase. Lauren, if we can go to the next slide. So here, as you can see, the scenario planning is really the heart of all of the work that you did so far. And now you're going to break it down by basically marrying the action with the vendors' information and make credible plans of what is possible next year, what is possible the year after that, and build a plan which essentially, as you can see on the right, there are multiple options for you to choose from. But when you evaluate all of this information, you'll be able to see that what is the right path for your company, and that's the commitment you can do. Obviously, aligning that with what the global standards are to keep it, under well below 2 degrees, or it's going to be a medium ambition, which is for 1.5 degrees, or a high ambition can be also something that we can explore. Next slide. So this is the end result of that exercise. It gives us more confidence in being able to say, this is what we will be able to achieve by 2026. And then by 2032, we can have 42% reduction. This is an example of how the exploration process can reveal like what are the action that you can actually take. Next slide. So just bringing it all together, lessons learned. Some of this I've already covered, but I want to make sure that I like 2 takeaways from this. First is focusing and breaking down your goals, and then seeing what the realistic trajectory is, and focusing on reversing that trajectory, because sometimes your business is growing and your emissions are growing with it, right? And the second takeaway is when you have the opportunity to invest that money in your business rather than buying offsets at the end, always make the investment in your business, because that takes your money for the long term of your business, and it will help you. You'll reap like benefits of it in future, and it'll pay dividends for you in the future as well. Yeah, I think the rest I have covered. The one thing I would also mention here is that on the very right, you can see that the data gives you a lot of understanding of what happened in the past years as well. So, for example, one of the examples we saw is there was price surges because of the Ukraine war, and the natural gas price increased. So the company actually spent more money even though they consumed less. This kind of analysis also gives you an idea of why future-proofing your operations and not being dependent on these external factors can be in a long-term good business strategy. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So I wanted to close it with a few important points. Decarbonization is an industrial imperative. You can follow Canadian Climate Institute to get some of the latest climate research that there is. But there are stuff that was already mentioned, like drivers, regulations, investors asking for these questions, your downstream partners, so your buyers are asking these questions. It is happening, even with all the US politics that we are seeing in the EU, in Asia. All of this process is already under the way, and this is an industrial imperative. It's like fixing an old machine. You will have to do that to improve the efficiency, and it's the matter of time, like how soon do you do it? Next slide. All right, this is a climate cost tracker also from the Canadian Climate Institute, which is showing how frequent and extreme weather situation we're all facing right now. Currently, there are 100 wildfires going on in Canada, and obviously this is to say that we all have to collectively think about this, and be able to do what we can in our whatever it is in our control. Next slide. So everything is not doom and gloom. So we have seen some policies have impacted our Canada's trajectory of, and then, like I mentioned in the lessons learned, reversing the trend is really important, and starting the reduction path. And as you can see now, Canada is lower, 8.5% lower than its 2005 levels, which is great news. But we need more policies to be able to keep track on our 2035 goal. So we are, as a country, we have a legally binding target of reaching 45 to 50% below the 2005 levels by 2035. Last slide. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the US tariff very delicately because it's a very volatile environment. Everything is changing constantly. But I do want to highlight the fact that the cost of raw materials are going to go up, and the bottom line, especially for small, medium-sized businesses, is going to get impacted, which is also going to drive more energy saving and cost saving measures. But the businesses are going to shift. You'll see a reduced reliance from Canada side. You'll see a reduced reliance on US trade. And from the US side, there will be more search for domestic and nearshore vendors, and hopefully the USMCA compliant suppliers will be given more priority. But at the same time, whatever happens in the US impacts Canada. So this is again, this is a very delicate situation, and want to make sure that going green is sort of something nice to have, but I think all of these politics have made it more front and center. So I just wanted to leave that thought as the ending thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sneha, Raphael, Emily. Hopefully she can make it her way back on here. I see we already have a question, so happy to just jump right in. So Naomi, if you want to come off mute.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the great information today. I have two questions. One is, will we be provided with the contact information for the three presenters today to be able to contact them for further information? I just noticed that all of our details are hidden in the Teams chat with respect to emails. And then the second question I have is, our company actually made a commitment, a near-term target commitment with SBTI back in 2022. So we have our baseline inventories 2022, and we've been tracking 2023 and 2024. And the question I have with respect to the ECCC program in comparison is that I noticed from our inventories, our carbon inventories through SBTI, upstream emissions and downstream emissions from virgin and landfill products are not considered an inventory for measurements based on, well, we're doing scope 1 or 2, so I'm not sure if that factors into scope 3, and perhaps that's the reason. And then the second question in relation to the comparison of the two programs, I did look at SBTI's offsets because our company is less than a tenth of the max requirements for SMEs for scope 1 and scope 2. We have very, very low emissions. We already underwent lighting conversions in our operations actually almost a decade ago. And SBTI actually does not consider carbon offsets as an element that you can utilize to reduce your tons of CO2 equivalent. So does ECCC differ in that manner? And perhaps these are too detailed, and perhaps, maybe a secondary conversation is needed, so not to completely monopolize the rest of the group's time. But those were just my preliminary questions.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. So the contact information is on the slide right now. I'm just working on typing it into the chat as well, but we can put that in the email as well on the recording and the slides. In terms of responding, I'll leave that, Raphael. I don't know if you can respond to that or if that's more of Emily directed, but please take it away.
Yeah, just given the link with their program and the kind of recognition for SBTI stuff, I just don't want to opine on her behalf, but I think either myself or Lauren, we can send them to Emily and get back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Great presentation. Thank you.
I think, Dan, you had your hand raised. Is that question answered?
No, it was an accident. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. Emmanuel?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for this quite interesting content. As I mentioned during Emily's presentation, Rigitex is taking part to the challenge. And last week or the week before, I attended a webinar, and we had a presentation about the new federal law, the C-59, and I was quite shocked actually, because on the one side, ECCC is asking us to take public commitment toward carbon neutrality, and on the other side, at the person who was presenting the impact of the new law, it was quite shocking to see that people could come after us because we were taking those public statements as we are going toward carbon neutrality. And they told us that we could be fined guilty just because we were using the carbon neutrality term. And we could get a fee as 3% of our how would you say that? Chiffre d'affaires. I just forgot the English word. And so I was quite shocked because as I am firmly invested toward carbon neutrality at Rigitex, and we put so much effort. And on the other, a federal law was asking us to just count down. So how can we manage both trends? On the one side, we are asked to take public commitment, and on the other side, we are asked to be greenwashing, will I say? So I was quite confused, and I was about to reach out to Emily to find out what should be the right and safe position for a company with, genuinely putting so much efforts, manpower, and money toward carbon neutrality.
Yeah, I guess I can maybe take that one just to say I think we'll whether Lauren and I will reach out to Emily for that question. I know from chatting with Emily that the program is seized as well with the C-59 conversation in the Competition Bureau. So I know that they're thinking about it from their side as well from a program perspective. But just in terms of the the details in terms of what's coming next, we'll be able to loop back with Emily.
Okay, so I can breathe again. Because I had almost a heart attack. So totally. No, it was quite frightening. Oh God. Okay, thank you so much, Raphael.
Of course.
Any other questions for our panelists? If not, I have one that for my own personal reasons. So it was mentioned about, when you make reductions in your own scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, then that means your downstream customers and benefit from that in terms of their scope 3 emissions. So I know as we're moving away from a focus on scope 1 and 2 and looking at broader scope 3 emissions, how would we go about accounting for the reductions that our upstream suppliers have? If, is it a matter of just you need to have those good relationships and having that communication of the reductions, or I guess how are other companies approaching those reductions and accounting for those savings?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first stab, and Sneha don't hesitate to come in after. I think from our perspective, I think there's definitely, especially for SMEs, that tools and the resources to be able to undertake the full scope of Scope 3 emissions and analyze every single last detail. The first step that we are seeing in different sectors that are also quite heavily composed by SMEs is to really start with analyzing where's the materiality for Scope 3 from a business perspective. And so what I mean by that is Scope 3 has a range of different categories that you can study and cover and quantify. And I think the step one for companies to really try to make sure that there's efficiency and that you can build momentum as a company is to start to look at those categories one by one and to say, where from our perspective do we feel like there's potentially a bigger emissions profile? So even for the textiles industry, the ones that I have in mind are category 1, which is purchased goods and services. So obviously that would be quite relevant for a number of folks. Category 4 as well deals with upstream transportation and distribution. And so parsing out those categories and singling out the ones that might be the most important, I think, is the first step. And then identifying, as you point out, Lauren, really where those relationships lie with partners and identifying whether it's simple requirements or simple disclosure from the partners that you're dealing with on those categories that you've identified as being relevant for your business. So even if it's a textile industry that's providing you with yarn or that's providing you with specific material, starting with where are you on the certification for certain international standards, where are you on certain elements, and that would provide you with at least the relationship to start building towards a full or broader quantification of Scope 2. So I think Scope 3, sorry. So I think my two kind of main comments are on start with the materiality, look at the categories in Scope 3 that make sense for your business, prioritize them, and then identify which ones you have relationships with your partners on and which one you feel you can start with just simple disclosures that can build momentum through time.
Yeah, so the one thing I'll just add there is just to simplify, what happens is if your upstream suppliers have decarbonized or they electrified their operations and their Scope 1, Scope 2 has reduced, it basically reduces your emission factor for that supplier. And so your calculation will show in the Scope 3 calculation, depending on which category you're looking at, will show the reduction based on that. If you are doing a spend-based calculation, you probably won't see that reduction. But if you go details into like which supplier you're getting what products from, and then based on that product, the emission factor is applied, then that reduction will show on your Scope 3.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Any other questions from anybody here? Question from Dan in the chat. How important is a focus on internal process efficiency improvements as a first step ahead of capital investment?
Yeah, I can maybe take again a first stab at it, and definitely Sneha would benefit from your case studies as well. The cop-out answer I would give Dan is it matters obviously on where your business process lie. What I would say is, from my perspective, and when we look at different transitions, it would be helpful for companies to start at the end point of 2050 and then backgas 25 years from now. What I mean by that is, if you are a company, for instance, that relies on natural gas for a thermal process, the natural gas process at the end in 2050 will likely need to be electrified. And so if I'm a small business, I'm in the textile industry, I rely on natural gas, and I know that in 25 years I will need to electrify my equipment, I would start there and assess where the capital lies and what kind of capital investment I need to make. Because with SMEs that have limited capital flows, the biggest dent that you can make on the emissions is to electrify the natural gas processes. However, there's two other things that I would say. For companies that have already electrified or that are usually mostly relying on either machines or electricity as a general concept, those companies, the process efficiency measures will have a big impact in reducing those emissions because they've already transitioned or they're already into an electric stage. So I think depending on if you are using natural gas or if you are already electrified, the choices will be different, and where you prioritize the process efficiency will differ. It is for sure something that can yield easy return on investments, but I would say the most important point is to look 25 years down the road and assess the capital investment that are going to need to be made for your main equipment. Yeah,
I just had a follow up on that. It basically internal process efficiency I would say is an ongoing process, irrespective of you're thinking about emissions or not. And I think it does have like a byproduct of that is that you will, basically save costs on, the waste that you are probably creating without having an efficient process. And then that will also reduce your emissions. So thinking about process efficiency would be like the number one in even if you were not committed to net zero.
Thank you. I think if there's no more questions, we can wrap things up. Thank you again to our speakers, Sneha, Raphael, and Emily. If your question wasn't answered today, please feel free to reach out to the speakers, or I'm putting my email in the chat as well, if you want me to pass any information along. And we will follow up with the recording and the slides and contact information for all the speakers today. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone. Bye.